The cold wind howled through the empty streets as Daniel pulled his tattered coat tighter around his thin frame. The city never slept, but for people like him, people who had nowhere to go, it was nothing but a vast, unkind world. He sat on the sidewalk, his back against the rough brick wall of an old building, watching people walk past him as if he were invisible. The scent of food from nearby restaurants teased his empty stomach, but hunger was something he had learned to live with. Then, out of nowhere, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The door swung open, and out stepped a man who looked like he belonged in a different world. Sharp suit, expensive watch, confidence in every step. The kind of man who had never known hunger, never spent a night shivering on the pavement. His name was Ethan Cole, a millionaire whose wealth was as well known as his arrogance. He was the kind of person who believed money could buy anything: power, respect, and even people's dignity. Daniel barely looked up, expecting nothing. But then, Ethan did something unexpected. He stopped right in front of him, pulling out his wallet with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice smooth, but laced with something unkind. "How about a hot meal? My treat." Daniel hesitated. Was this a trick? A joke? People didn't just offer things for free, not in this city. But his stomach ached with hunger, and the thought of warm food was too tempting to resist. Slowly he nodded. Ethan led him into one of the most luxurious restaurants in town. The moment they stepped inside, the change in atmosphere was almost suffocating. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above them. Soft piano music played in the background, and the scent of freshly cooked meals filled the air. But as soon as Daniel entered, the room fell silent. People turned to stare, whispers, raised eyebrows, judgmental glances. The host, a man in a crisp black suit, looked at Ethan with confusion. "Sir, is everything all right?" "Of course," Ethan replied, grinning. "My friend here will be dining with me tonight." Daniel felt every eye in the room burning into him. His clothes, his unshaven face, the way he shifted uncomfortably. It was clear he didn't belong. But Ethan seemed to enjoy the attention, as if he had just done something noble. They sat at a table by the window. A waiter hesitated before placing menus in front of them, eyeing Daniel with obvious doubt. Ethan leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table, looking amused. "Order whatever you want," he said. "Go on, don't be shy." Daniel glanced at the menu, but the words blurred together. It had been so long since he had eaten a proper meal that he barely remembered what it felt like to choose food without counting coins. He pointed at a simple dish, something safe, something that wouldn't cost too much. Ethan laughed. "Come on, live a little, get the steak, and a bottle of wine too." Daniel hesitated, but nodded. He didn't understand why Ethan was being so generous, but he wasn't going to question it. The food arrived quickly, steaming, rich, unlike anything he had tasted in years. He picked up his fork, about to take a bite, when Ethan suddenly clinked his glass loudly, drawing the room's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan announced, his voice carrying across the restaurant, "I just want to take a moment to remind everyone how fortunate we are. Tonight, I decided to help someone in need. Someone who, let's be honest, doesn't usually get to enjoy a place like this." Laughter rippled through the room, quiet but sharp, like knives hidden beneath silk. Daniel froze, his grip tightening on his fork. Ethan smiled at him, but there was no warmth in it. "How does it feel, buddy? Sitting here, eating food you could never afford. Bet it tastes better when it's free, huh?" The laughter grew louder. The whispers turned to open mockery. Daniel's face burned, his appetite vanishing. He had been tricked, not with words, but with kindness that had sharp edges. Ethan leaned in, lowering his voice so only Daniel could hear. I just wanted to remind you how different we are. Enjoy your meal. Daniel stared at the plate in front of him. Hunger replaced by something else. Something stronger. But he didn't say a word. Not yet. Because what Ethan didn't know was that this night wouldn't end the way he expected. Daniel swallowed hard, the laughter around him ringing in his ears. His hands clenched into fists under the table, but he kept his face expressionless. He had been humiliated before, on the streets, in shelters, by people who looked at him with either disgust or pity. But this was different. This wasn't a careless insult thrown in passing. This was planned. Ethan had brought him here, not out of kindness, but as a joke, a spectacle for an audience that thrived on wealth and arrogance. He looked at Ethan, who was sipping his wine with an easy smirk, as if he had already won. To him, Daniel was nothing more than an afterthought, a moment of entertainment before he moved on to something else. But Daniel wasn't just some nameless man on the streets. He had a past, a life before the nights spent on sidewalks and the hunger gnawing at his ribs. He hadn't always been here. A long time ago, Daniel Parker had a name that meant something. He had a job, an apartment, a life. He had once sat in restaurants like this, not as a guest of someone's mockery, but as someone who belonged. He had worked in finance, just like Ethan, once moving in similar circles. But life had a cruel way of taking everything away in an instant. A bad investment, a market crash, and within months, everything crumbled. Debt piled up, friends disappeared. The apartment became impossible to afford, and just like that, he had fallen. One missed payment at a time, one closed door after another, until the streets were all he had left. Daniel had accepted the fall, but sitting here, being laughed at by people who had never known struggle, something inside him stirred. Something he thought he had buried beneath years of survival. Ethan's laughter was cut off as an older man at a nearby table cleared his throat. "You must feel proud of yourself," he said, voice calm but sharp. Ethan turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "Excuse me." The man set down his glass, watching Ethan with a quiet intensity. "You wanted an audience. You wanted everyone to see your generosity." He leaned forward slightly. "But all I see is a man trying too hard to prove his worth at someone else's expense." The restaurant grew silent. For the first time that night, Ethan's confidence wavered. He forced a chuckle, shaking his head. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was just helping." The man interrupted. "That's not what you were doing." He turned to Daniel. "Son, eat your meal. You don't owe anyone here a reaction." Daniel hesitated, then picked up his fork again. His hands were steady this time. He wasn't just eating anymore. He was making a statement. He wouldn't let Ethan win. Ethan forced another laugh. But it was strained now. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected turn of events. His plan had been simple. Bring a homeless man in, make a spectacle, walk away, feeling superior. But now, the attention wasn't on Daniel. It was on him. The whispers had changed. No longer amused, but questioning. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I don't need a lecture," he muttered, pushing back his chair. He stood up, throwing a few bills onto the table. "Enjoy your night." And just like that, he was gone. Daniel took a deep breath, letting the moment settle. He glanced at the older man, giving him a small nod. There was no need for words. The moment had already passed, but something had shifted inside him. This wasn't the end of his story, not even close. Daniel sat there for a moment, letting the tension in the restaurant settle around him. The food in front of him, once a symbol of Ethan's cruelty, now felt different. It wasn't about pity anymore. It wasn't about proving anything. It was just a meal, one that, for the first time in a long while, felt like it belonged to him. The older man, who had spoken up for him, finished his drink and stood. He gave Daniel one last nod before walking out, leaving behind an odd sense of warmth in an otherwise cold night. Daniel wasn't used to kindness. Real kindness. It felt unfamiliar, but something about it lingered. As he picked up his fork and took a bite, he could still hear the murmurs around the room. Some people whispered about Ethan's behavior. Others just moved on, uninterested in anything beyond their own conversations. But Daniel didn't care anymore. He had spent years being looked through, ignored, treated as an inconvenience. But tonight, for the first time in years, he had been seen. Not as someone to be pitied, not as someone to be mocked, but as a person. The meal was good, better than he had expected. He ate slowly, savoring every bite, not rushing to finish as if someone might take it away. By the time he walked out of the restaurant, the night air had lost its bite. He stepped onto the sidewalk, hands tucked into his pockets, and took a deep breath. The city stretched before him, endless, indifferent. But tonight, something felt different. As he turned the corner, he spotted the sleek black car again. Ethan was leaning against it, phone in hand, looking annoyed. When he saw Daniel, he scoffed. "So, what now? You think you won something?" Daniel stopped, meeting his gaze. He didn't feel anger anymore. He didn't even feel resentment. Just a quiet understanding. "You don't get it, do you?" Ethan rolled his eyes. "Enlighten me." Daniel smiled, but there was something in his expression that made Ethan falter. "You wanted to remind me how different we are, and you did, but not in the way you think." Ethan frowned, crossing his arms. "Yeah? And what does that mean?" "It means you'll wake up tomorrow exactly the same as you are now," Daniel said simply. "But I won't." Ethan scoffed again, but this time it wasn't as confident. He looked at Daniel like he wanted to say something, but instead he just shook his head, climbed into his car, and drove off. Daniel watched the taillights disappear into the night. Then he turned and kept walking. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if his life would change overnight or if he'd still wake up on the same cold pavement. But tonight, he had been reminded of something important. He wasn't done yet, and for the first time in a long time, he believed that meant something.